Hello, everyone. Thank you for being all here. It's great to see so many people. So today's talk will be around the state of GraphQL clients. Are there any GraphQL users here besides me? Nice. Are there any people interested in using GraphQL? It's all of you, right? Or not? Well, maybe after today's talk. So hello again. Maybe for some of you, I was here last year. So happy to be back at the same venue. Maybe if you were there, you can still find yourself somewhere on there. My name is Roy. I'm a lifelong software developer doing all sorts of stuff. I used to work at a startup called StepSend, but we were acquired by a little company called IBM. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. You might also know me from the books I've written or some of the talks I gave at conferences. So what are the most popular GraphQL clients? If you're using GraphQL, you're probably using a client, or maybe you're just doing fetch. That's something we'll touch on later on as well. And for this, I looked at the state of GraphQL survey. Actually, there wasn't a survey available for this year. I believe it will be probably coming out somewhere soon. So I looked at the survey of 2022. So we might be using slightly old data. But that's fine. I mean, ChatGPT is using data that's older as well. So let's look at the client ranking. I think they're already sorted. So what kind of surprised me is that the most popular one is actually GraphQL hooks. And this is a GraphQL client that's actually very underrepresented at talks I see or videos I see. So if you're using GraphQL hooks, it would be good to maybe create some content around it, because people have been working on it, and apparently it's very popular, or they rigged the entire survey, which I hope they didn't. Of course, there's GraphQL request there, and React Query, Oracle, and also Apollo Client, which is probably the most talked about GraphQL client. If we deep dive a bit further, you can actually see that Apollo Client is kind of popular amongst users, so people that are using it are kind of happy with it. Same for React Query and most of the other ones. Actually, most people are not really interested in using no client. So maybe that's a good thing to know as well. So let's explore some of these clients. Usually I try to give some code demos, but as we don't have too much time today, I'll just be showing you a overview of what we're doing. So maybe after this talk, you're going to decide you want to use a different GraphQL client instead of the one you're using at the moment. So let's start with no client. Is someone using GraphQL without a client? Nice, one of you is, or maybe two. Well, that's good. I'd like to say maybe you're a bit old school, no pun at you, but I do like the movie. I think it's one of the movies I really liked at high school. So no client. I think it's fine to don't use a client when you're working with a GraphQL API, especially if your use case isn't too complex and maybe you're just trying to consume it without too much bells and whistles. It's interesting to see that most people that are using no client are kind of happy with it and not really looking to go somewhere else, whereas also a lot of people are sort of ruling it out to even begin with. So it's nice to see that there's sort of a 50-50 spread on whether or not people like it. Something else that's pretty cool, I believe Prisma created this, it's GraphQL request. It's mostly like a thin wrapper around fetch. It's doing some of the things that you do repeatedly when you don't use a client. If you're using GraphQL, you probably know that every request is post. You always need to set the application type to JSON. You need to pass a body containing a GraphQL operation and variables, those kind of things. It's all very repetitive, so GraphQL request is taking away some of that pain. I also like to say, and I really like the maintainers, so nothing against them, but it's a bit like a no client plus. You're using GraphQL with a client, but you're basically using fetch with a small wrapper. So maybe we should start and investigate for other GraphQL client options. Another one we could use is React Query. Maybe we're supposed to say 10-stack query today. I'm not really sure. So React Query is really good in helping you to sort of streamline your data fetching across your application. It has some nice methods for caching, really helping you to handle that sort of server-side state in your applications in an efficient way. But when we're talking about GraphQL clients, I always like to say that React Query might be REST data fetching with GraphQL support. Because usually when you're using React Query with GraphQL, you're still using no client inside your React Query request, or maybe using GraphQL request. So you're not taking full advantage of all the sort of tools that are out there to help you work with GraphQL APIs. So what are some of the more advanced GraphQL clients? And for this, again, we're going to look at the list that we saw earlier on. I think earlier on I said actual GraphQL clients, but I don't know, it kind of feels bad for GraphQL requests as they in some way are a GraphQL client. But more of the popular ones, which we saw in the survey results, are these ones. I guess especially Apollo Client, Jekyll, and GraphQL hooks. They're pretty similar, so let's zoom in on those first. And after that, we're going to have a look at Relay, because Relay, at least in my experience, is kind of undervalued. Maybe because it feels like it might be more complicated. They also did some sort of a version 2 a couple years ago after doing a version 1. So I guess people still sort of try to relate it against the version 1, maybe similar as people will do with Angular and AngularJS. So let's have a look at these 3 clients. We have Apollo Client, GraphQL hooks, and Jekyll. I would like to show you some code, but I also try to be respectful of all your lunch breaks and coffee breaks and those kind of things. And I think you're all perfectly capable of, if you're inspired after this talk, have a look at what the code will look like. So all these clients will have a similar syntax. If you used any of them, you probably have a good understanding on how to use the other ones. So the basic setup is you would wrap your application in a provider. To this provider, you would pass a client, which contains the sort of the authentication details to your GraphQL API. And then from your components, you would be able to use hooks or maybe even class components if you're still into those, or the sorts of functions to send requests to the GraphQL API and get your data. They will all have some fancy things in there to help you with caching, to help you with getting a loading state or an error state or the data that's being returned. And maybe they also do sort of lightweight state management. So the syntax is pretty similar. I think I already said they all support caching, so that's a good thing to know. They all have sort of support for client-side, but also for server-side rendering. So that's something that might interest you as well. If we look at extensibility and bundle size, I guess that's where Apollo Client, even though being the most popular one or most famous one from this list, they sort of lack in there because they aren't too extensible. And they also have quite a huge bundle size. So it's something to take into consideration if you're really worried about your bundle size. Maybe some of you are, maybe some of you aren't, but so one of the most frustrating things is finding a library you like and then finding out it increases your bundle size maybe by 10 or 20 or 30%. Makes it kind of hard to sell it against your coworkers who are really picking on the bundle size. So these clients are all perfectly fine. They share the same syntax. They have all these cool bells and whistles. But I also wanted to talk about Relay. As mentioned, it might be one of the most undervalued GraphQL clients. Could be because of that version 1 that people maybe disliked. So Relay, if you look at the numbers, it's actually kind of, well, some of the people are just ruling it out as a whole. Some people are just saying, I wouldn't use it. Some people say, I'm not interested. I'm wondering why, though, because I'm going to show you how it works. So imagine you're building this application. Maybe you have a list of products. You have products component rendering. And inside those components for a product, you would have more components, like pricing and review. Maybe you have breadcrumbs or a category overview of all sorts of things you could add in there. I used to work in e-commerce, so I built quite a few of these React applications. Happy not to have to do it anymore, but so the question here you would have is probably where would you send the request from? Because you have this product list, you have all these different products, you have reviews. In a GraphQL world, and I guess especially in a non-relay GraphQL world, you probably have a query that looks like this, which you need in order to fill your UI with all the data. You would probably send this query from the top level, right? That product list. In there you might have state management, or maybe you have one of those GraphQL clients. And from that component, you're sending a request to the GraphQL API containing this query. And then you sort of retrieve the data. You will get a list of products. Maybe you get more info, like, I don't know, pagination, or maybe some sort of health status. And what you probably start to do is you're going to pass down all these props. So in your product list component, you have this product component that you're iterating over. You're probably passing down props such as ID and title and thumbnail. But as you have these reviews and pricing components, you're probably also passing down these subsets of data. Because of course you also want to show the reviews and the pricing within their own components. So you're basically just doing some prop drilling. And maybe you're smart and you're using state management. Could be all sorts of state management. Maybe you're using context. I hope you're not using context for this scenario. It's perfectly fine to use it maybe for a dark mode or a light mode. Probably wouldn't use it here. But suppose you're using some sort of state management where you put all the data in a context-like solution, and you're sort of retrieving this data from your components through this context. This is something you could be doing. You don't have to drill the props, but you still have some sort of a local place where you would pass the information from the request. It's perfectly fine, but I don't think it's the most efficient way of doing this. And in my opinion, Relay can do this better. So, is anyone here using Relay? No one is? Oh, we have one person, maybe two. Okay, so I have some convincing to do. So Relay is using something which they call a compiler. And I'm going to show you how this compiler works. It's pretty cool that they use this sort of compiling thing because it really takes away some of the repetitive tasks you might have to do otherwise. It would also take away prop drilling. So the way it works, you would have this same component, or this sort of tree of components. You're rendering a list of products, you have products components, and then there are subcomponents in there, and maybe you go even further down the component tree. So what Relay does, it will take fragments that you would define in each of these components and compile them into one single query. So instead of you passing the entire query from the top level and then sort of drill the props, it will be compiled into a single query that is then passed to the GraphQL API. And the GraphQL API, through Relay, of course, will then store the data in a data store. So you would get one centralized sort of location where all your data is stored. And then through this centralized location, your components are able to read the data and render it in your application. And this is also pretty cool if you're using if you maybe have data that's repetitive or you have fragments that you're reusing across different components. Because as this is all stored in this data store, Relay is aware of data that could be reused. So maybe you're getting a pricing setup somewhere in your product, and later on someone would click on the product page to go to a single product. Relay is able to take some of the data from those fragments and reuse it, meaning that it will speed up your queries. Because the compiler itself, it would also make sure that you're retrieving less data from the GraphQL API. So it's like a win-win solution without you having to set up any additional state management, at least for this specific part of your application. Not saying you shouldn't use state management, but you might not need it for this particular use case where you're using GraphQL. And then there's another, it's more like an open-ended question. For those of you who are using GraphQL, are you using code generation to create like TypeScript codes? Nice, that's good to see. Well, a question I might have is, in case you're using code generation to create GraphQL types for your schema, but also all the operations defined in your application, I think it might be a good question if you actually need to have a GraphQL client, because in theory you don't really have to know which GraphQL client you're using. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Even though you might get the benefit of doing code generation, have a look at the GraphQL client you're using there as well. Maybe there are some upsides you could actually get, or maybe using something like Relay, and I believe code generation works to it until, well, at least for part of it, which could be useful for you there as well. So which client should you use? It's a question I also get from people. Should I use Apollo client? Should I use GraphQL hooks? Should I use Relay? Should I use no client? I think the best question to this answer is sort of use whatever you like and use what your team like. It's good to be informed, knowing the sort of differences from them, knowing whatever makes them a potentially better GraphQL client for your team or for you as a person, depending on what you're working on. Maybe you're working on a side project and you don't really care about it. Well, just pick whatever you like. Because in the end, I always feel like teamwork will make the dream work. So if you are working on GraphQL, you work together with a team, pick the client you like. You've seen the short overview on what are the upsides and downsides, so hopefully that will help you a bit as well. So that was it. Thank you. And let's stay in touch, maybe here at the conference or on social media. Thank you.